Hey, this is Edward Lambert, Effective Demand Research, and this is going to be part two of the video on how the Fed rate moved through the Volcker recession years. So, I don't know if I should recap the first video or not, but just to say that you have these natural, real levels of GDP. This is the natural, real one, and this is the one that was fabricated by the Fed in order to control inflation. This one was fabricated with a higher real interest rate at 6%. The natural one has a natural interest rate of 3%. Fed manufactured a natural real rate of interest of 6% to put the brakes on inflation, to really control how money was used. And so we went through, these blue dots came through the green dots, and we ended the part one of this video on third quarter 1988. And that would be this green dot right here. The economy had just gotten back to the natural, real level. This is the real, natural. This is where the economy is supposed to be. This is where the economy wants to be naturally. At this level of total factor utilization rate of using capital and labor. So now as we see, as the economy comes back, the Fed starts to increase the Fed rate. That's why this dark blue line. If you have any doubt of what these lines are, you'll have to go back to part one, the first part of part one, and catch the description of these lines. I'm not going to go through it now. But third quarter 1988, here we are, this green dot. The economy's coming in. We're going to see as we go to the first quarter of 1989, 6 months later, that the Fed has raised their Fed funds rate up to here. The economy has stopped as natural, as normal, at the natural real GDP level. That'll take the Fed rate up here. So let's go ahead and do that. So the Fed rate's gone up, and inflation, and here's the inflation line, and the current real interest rate are at the exact same point, which is kind of interesting, but they're above the natural real rate where they're supposed to cross as the economy comes back in. So what this means is that the Fed has control. Inflation's still a little bit higher than where it needs to be, and as the economy's coming back in, the Fed now has control over inflation. Back in the late 70s, if I go back and show you that real fast, it was here. The current real interest rate was way low. That's expansionary. And so that expansionary effect just turned into inflation and got out of control. But now, you'll see is like the return here, that brown line moved way up to around 5%. So now the real interest rate is higher than this natural rate here. Before it was lower than this natural rate, now it's higher than this natural rate. The Fed has control of the economy, and they're going to still try and bring down inflation. So here they are, and they've jumped up the Fed rate. Of course, this is most likely going to cause a contraction, and it does. So as we go to the third quarter 1989, we'll go from these green dots to these pink dots. So we have a contraction going on here. As it goes to the left here, that's less capital used or less labor used in the economy, so it's a contraction of utilizing our resources. And what we have down here is that the current real interest rate is still above, so it's still contractionary. The Fed is still trying to get control of this thing. Even though it looks like the economy is contracting, the Fed is still being aggressive, trying to bring down the inflation rate. But all to their credit, because eventually they're going to bring this back into balance. It's going to be a beautiful thing to see. So let's go 6 months later. This will be the first quarter of 1990. Fed rates come down a little bit. Inflation's still around 4.6%. The current real interest rate still higher. See here, from here to here, it's still higher, so the Fed's controlling it, maintaining it, keeping it from getting too expansionary. There's no expansionary effects going on here. As back in the late 70s, you saw it go up. When it reached this point, as these dark blue dots came in, the effect was to go up. Now, as these green dots come in, the effect is to come down. They'll follow this pink line here. Whereas before, they followed this red line into all kinds of inflation. Now the Fed has control by looking at the current real interest rate above this natural interest rate. So now we're going to go to the third quarter of 1990. Right here, stabilizing in. First quarter 1991. Boom. 6 months later, there's a contraction. This is the 1991 recession. So what do we see here going on? Well, inflation's jumped back up over 5%. So there's some concern here. Maybe there's some inflation starting to pop back in, but we're in a recession. So the current real interest rate goes low to try and bring the recession, try and bring the economy out of recession. And 6 months later, Fed rate's still coming down, but we see inflation coming down. It's a recession, and the prices are coming down. Real rate came up a little bit. Go to the first quarter 1992. We see that the current real interest rate's gone almost down to 0. But we also see that here's where the Fed rate is. Come down. It's not that expansionary. It's still pretty well under control. This is the brilliant part of what's going on now, is the Fed is bringing down inflation, bringing down the real interest rate during the recession to this stabilization point. The Fed is getting back on track with these lines that come from my equations, this dashed blue line and this purple line here. These signify the paths that the Fed rate should take in order to maintain a path to this target, to their target. As we can see now, that the Fed rate is getting close to this line here, and the current real interest rate is getting close to the natural rate. The Fed is actually bringing these things back into line in the midst of a little recession here. Brilliant. So now we come to here, and the Fed is now on the Fed rate path to their target. And the real interest rate, current real interest rate, is just a little bit below the natural real interest rate, so it's a little bit inflationary, just a little bit. So there's plenty of nice control to get going back up. And what we're going to see now with these pink dots is they're going to follow right back up this, close to this line that I have drawn in here. So that's my equation. For my work into effective demand, my equation is signaling that this is the path that the Fed rate should take to get back to target. And it's funny because we're going to see from here to here, the Fed rate gets back to target right along that line. So, I mean, it's a confirmation of the equation I'm using, but it's also to show that this model is working to make sense of what the Fed does. Alright, so now we're going to go to the first quarter 1993. That's down here. So, inflation's coming down 3.5%, and the Fed rate is actually lower than inflation. You're going to see an expansionary effect by this brown line being below the blue line. So the Fed is actually encouraging a comeback from this recession. Let's go 6 months later, third quarter 1993. Right here, still low inflation, still low current real interest rates. So the Fed is encouraging the economy to come back. The Fed's actually taking a little bit of a risk here because the Fed rate's close to inflation and it's below this path. So they're taking a little bit of a risk here, but they're trying to get the economy back going here. 6 months later, they're right here. Inflation's coming down, the real interest rate's coming back up. Let's go out to the third quarter 1994. Alright, we've jumped from this pink dot to this pink dot. So the economy is recovering, and it's heading towards this natural level again. But look at what's going on here. Right now, the blue dot, the blue dashed line and the brown dashed line are very close together. Just a little bit of expansionary effect. And the Fed rate is very close to the Fed path of balance to stay on target. So the Fed, through all these gyrations back here to control inflation, set to maintain this fabricated natural real GDP, and bringing it back up here and slowing it down as it reached the real GDP level. The economy came back, and in this midst of this 1991 recession, the Fed coordinated the interest rates to bring them back into line right here, so that the lines are coming back together. Now, first quarter 1995. Boom. This is just brilliant. You can see that the Fed rate is very close to target, and look at the Fed has stabilization. This dashed brown line and this dashed blue line and this slanting down brown line all coordinate perfectly to their target. It's just brilliant. It's amazing how through all these gyrations they were able to bring it right back onto target. Inflation is just a little bit higher, than what they want. I'm thinking 2 to 2.5% inflation target. It's 2.9%. It's just almost perfect. And now we'll just finish it off. 6 months later, the economy has jumped back to here, but the Fed rate's just it's right on track. There's still stabilization. There's just a little bit of a setback in the economy 6 months later. Let's come back to here. The current interest rate, current real interest rate has gone down a little bit. Still some stabilization. The blue dashed line and the brown dashed line are pretty close together. And there's some control there just to try and keep some control on inflation. 6 months later, right here, we've got stabilization, perfect. The Fed has got it perfectly stabilized, right on track, right on this path here. They got the Fed rate right on the path, and they've got the current real interest rate crossing the natural real interest rate perfectly on path. Another 6 months later, right here, and they're still right perfectly on path. The Fed rate's right on path. The blue line and the brown line, they're all just perfectly right in path. Let's go another 6 months later, right here, and they're just right on path. These blue line, the brown line, and this downsloping brown line, all the natural interest rates are on target. And as we see over the next year or two from this point, the lines just hover right around in here. Inflation comes down right around to the 2% mark, and everything is just perfect. Going into 1998, 1999, the Fed has perfect balance on their target. I don't add these dots in there because the dots would just bunch up right around in here, and the blue line and the brown line, the dashed blue line and the dashed brown line would just stay right around this target right here because the inflation stayed steady and the Fed rate stayed steady right around in there. And they just maintained this perfect monetary balance right into the bubble. And maybe that was part of why the bubble got so strong, is because the monetary policy was so well in tune. So that's pretty much the story there. All right, I'm going to call this one done.